From the quiet of my corner office, I watched the live security feed on my laptop. It showed my parents, Hunter and Evelyn Harrison, sitting in the expansive executive lobby of Harrison Capital. They looked small and out of place amidst the cool tones of steel and glass I had chosen. My mother kept smoothing the fabric of her expensive dress, a repetitive, nervous gesture. My father, a man used to commanding time, now treated his watch like an adversary. A soft chime sounded on my intercom, followed by Nora's calm, steady voice. "Mr. Harrison," she said with practiced professionalism, "your parents are here for their 10 o'clock appointment." They had no idea they were meeting the new owner of the company. Nora knew the schedule, not the history I had with the two people waiting in the lobby. My parents didn't know either. Not yet. Watching them fidget on the custom-made Italian leather sofa, my mind was pulled back to a specific Thursday brunch, the day the world shifted beneath my feet. It had been just 2 weeks before my 27th birthday, the day I was set to receive a significant trust fund left to me by my maternal grandparents. We were at our usual upscale brunch spot when my mother leaned forward, her voice a thin, syrupy concoction of concern and manipulation. "Darling," she'd said, "we need to have a serious conversation about your trust fund." I had looked up from my Eggs Benedict, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I was still naive enough to think this was a conversation about investment strategies. It wasn't. They informed me, with a series of carefully rehearsed justifications, that my older brother, Lucas, their golden son, needed the money more. They painted my burgeoning tech company, Vantage Labs, as a childish hobby, a little project that was cute, but certainly not a real business worthy of serious capital. A few days later, they had me sign the papers under duress, framing it as a family obligation. They then wired the entire sum, $2,100,000, directly into Lucas's account. Their official reason was that it would help him learn responsibility. Now, months later, as I observed them waiting in the lobby of the company they had built and were about to lose, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. They had attempted to steal my future to finance my brother's present. They had failed. The uncertain young man from that brunch was gone, replaced by someone who had been forced to forge his own destiny from nothing but code and sheer will. And I had built enough to buy theirs. My childhood was a masterclass in being the overlooked middle child. I grew up in a sprawling suburban house, always in the shadow of my charismatic older brother, Lucas, and just a step ahead of my quiet, unassuming younger sister, Maya. Lucas could do no wrong. His every achievement was celebrated, his failures cushioned by our parents' endless support. My grandparents, however, saw something different in me. They saw a quiet determination, a methodical way of thinking that my parents mistook for a lack of ambition. That $2,100,000 trust was their vote of confidence, their way of giving me a stable foundation to build upon after college. My plan for it was simple and clear: use it as the seed capital to scale Vantage Labs. I had started the company in my tiny post-college apartment with a laptop I'd bought secondhand and a single, relentless idea. I wanted to democratize online commerce by creating a payment gateway that was both ironclad in its security and beautifully simple in its design. I envisioned a world where a small artisan selling handmade jewelry from their garage could compete on an even technological footing with a multinational corporation. While my university peers spent their weekends at parties, I was deep in lines of code, fueled by cheap coffee and instant noodles. I learned to fix my own cracked phone screen, drove a car that was more rust than metal, and poured every ounce of my energy and every spare dollar into Vantage Labs. My parents saw this dedication not as admirable, but as peculiar. My mom and dad measured success by the prestige of one's golf club and the length of one's client relationships, preferably cemented over expensive dinners. They never took my work seriously, often referring to it with condescending amusement at family gatherings. So, when the first whispers of interest came from angel investors, I kept it quiet. I knew that sharing the news would only invite their skepticism and dismissal. Then came the brunch, the betrayal, and the transfer of my future to Lucas for what they termed a concrete investment. That investment, I later learned, was a nightclub venture that was doomed from the start. They demanded my sacrifice and then fell silent, expecting me to quietly accept my diminished role in the family hierarchy. But I was not as alone as they believed. I had a small but fiercely loyal circle of allies. There was Nora, my assistant, who I'd hired after she'd been an intern at a company I consulted for. She ran my office with quiet, formidable efficiency. There was Marco, my lead engineer, a coding genius I'd met at a hackathon who could see the elegance in my vision and translate it into flawless architecture. And there was Dana, my head of product, who had an intuitive grasp of user experience and pushed me to make our platform not just functional, but delightful. They were the ones who saw me sleep on a cot in the office for the first 2 years. They were there for the bug fixes at 3 in the morning, the failed presentations to skeptical venture capitalists, and the stubborn, unyielding pride that kept me going when everything seemed impossible. Their belief was the fuel I needed. Slowly, then all at once, the tide turned. More investors started calling, this time with serious offers. Tech journalists from prominent publications began emailing for interviews. A well-known platform founder in Austin flew me out to discuss a strategic partnership. I meticulously structured the business, incorporating Vantage Labs as an LLC, and then created a parent entity, Vantage Holdings, to manage our growing portfolio of software products and intellectual property. The growth was not explosive. It was methodical, patient, and built on a solid foundation. While my parents' world was contracting, mine was expanding. Last fiscal year, when Harrison Capital's stock began its noticeable tumble, I watched the financial news not with glee, but with the sharp eye of an investor. I saw an opportunity born from their complacency. I also saw a chance to vindicate the young man they had dismissed at that brunch. An acquisition proposal landed in my inbox like a digital thunderclap. It was from a discreet investment bank that specialized in mergers for established, mature firms that were struggling to adapt. Harrison Capital, the venerable institution my parents had poured their lives into, was hemorrhaging clients. Their reliance on paper ledgers, handshake agreements, and an outdated relationship-based model was failing them in a tech-first world. The bank, representing a group of anxious board members, asked if Vantage Holdings might be interested in acquiring a controlling interest. The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. I held the fate of my parents' legacy in my hands. I could let it collapse under the weight of its own obsolescence, or I could intervene and steer what remained into the future. My hesitation was brief. My decision was not rooted in emotion, but in logic. I understood the unforgiving calculus of the modern market, and I had witnessed firsthand the destructive, blinding nature of pride. Buying Harrison Capital was the most strategic move. It would allow me to save the jobs of dozens of loyal employees, repurpose long-standing client relationships, and integrate their assets into my own growing ecosystem. It would also, undeniably, force my parents to confront the son they had written off. This moral crossroads was a complexity I was willing to navigate. My goal wasn't to crush them for the sake of revenge. It was to make them feel the full weight of their choices and, perhaps, facilitate a painful but necessary lesson. With the decision made, I set a precise plan in motion. Vantage Holdings would make a formal, public offer to acquire Harrison Capital. The offer would be generous enough to satisfy the board and preserve a shred of dignity. But the terms of the acquisition would be strict enough to ensure a complete changing of the guard. I had Marco's team run a deep-dive due diligence, unearthing every financial weakness and operational inefficiency. I briefed my legal teams, preparing them for a swift and decisive transaction. I even had Nora oversee a tasteful renovation of the executive lobby, replacing the stuffy, old-world decor with modern art and minimalist furniture. As I sat in my office, watching my parents on the monitor, I was besieged by a storm of old anger. Why had they done it? How could they so casually discard one child for another? I vividly remembered my mother's practiced smile as she explained how this was for the best, and my father's pompous lecture on responsibility, a lecture meant for me but which should have been directed at himself. Doubt, a cold and insidious visitor, tried to find a crack in my resolve. Was this an act of vindictive cruelty? Would this victory turn me into a colder, more calculating version of my father? I weighed the options. I could walk away, let the market deliver its own verdict, and watch from a distance as their world unraveled. Or I could act, stepping into the storm not just to conquer but to reconstruct. I replayed every dismissive comment, every condescending remark they had ever made about Vantage Labs. I pictured my father, a man who still wore ostentatious cufflinks that, to me, were tiny symbols of his arrogance, realizing that his most valuable clients had left him for platforms like mine. The anger pulsed hot and real, but beneath it, there was a quieter, deeper current of grief, the profound sadness of being fundamentally misunderstood by the two people who should have been my biggest champions. Then, a small, powerful memory broke through the noise. It was a note my grandfather had scribbled on a cocktail napkin for me years ago, shortly before he passed away. Work like every penny is yours to earn, because it is. That simple principle had been my guiding star. It helped me reframe my rage into something more focused, more useful. I would not be cruel. I would be exact. I would be a force of consequence. The public filing sent ripples through the financial world. As predicted, Harrison Capital's board, facing dire projections, quickly and unanimously recommended accepting our offer. The financial news outlets loved the narrative. The young, disruptive tech founder acquiring the legacy firm run by his own estranged family. Analysts debated my motives. Was this a compassionate rescue or a strategic, cold-blooded takeover? I ignored the speculation, focusing instead on the stock charts, feeling a hollow, detached thrill as the prices moved exactly as my models had predicted. There was no celebration, no champagne. I simply sat in my quiet office and reviewed the transition plan for the 100th time. The day I scheduled the meeting, I had Nora send a very formal, very discreet message to their office. Harrison Capital welcomes a meeting with Mr. and Mrs. Harrison and Mr. Ethan Harrison. The wording was deliberate. They were being summoned to their own company. Just as the final pieces were falling into place, a new report landed on my desk. It was from Nora, who had been discreetly tracking my brother's activities. Lucas, the recipient of my stolen inheritance, had lost everything. The entire $2,100,000 had vanished in a spectacular implosion of bad investments, lavish spending, and a failed nightclub. He had officially filed for bankruptcy. The news hit me with a strange, conflicting mix of righteous vindication and a surprising pang of sorrow for the brother I once knew. I could have walked into that meeting and used Lucas's failure as a cudgel, a final, brutal blow to their pride. But I chose restraint. The raw facts of their own failure would be weapon enough. When the meeting began in the main conference room, the one with the panoramic view of the city skyline, I let them carry the opening conversation. Their politeness was a brittle mask. Hunter, adopting the tone of a man accustomed to leading every meeting he was in, started with, "Ethan, we can't thank you enough for seeing us on such short notice." Evelyn tried to gloss over their long, awkward wait in the lobby by complimenting the new art. I let them talk, my back to the skyline. When they had exhausted their pleasantries, I turned my chair slowly to face them, ensuring I could watch their expressions change. This was the moment of truth. I let the data speak for itself, presenting the facts calmly and without accusation. I walked them through the valuation changes, the client departure logs, and the precise monetary losses their firm had incurred over the last 18 months as their clients migrated to modern digital platforms. I showed them charts and graphs that illustrated a company in freefall. I explained that Vantage Holdings was not a hostile aggressor, but their only remaining option for a soft landing. "This is not a negotiation," I stated calmly. "It is a transformation." The silence that descended upon the room was heavier and more damning than any shouted accusation could ever be. They protested, as I knew they would. "We had to help our son," Mom said, her voice finally breaking, losing its carefully modulated tone. "We did what any parents would do." Dad insisted, his face reddening. I let their excuses hang in the air until the silence became uncomfortable. Then, without a word, I nudged a thin folder into the center of the table. The papers inside weren't a secret, but seeing the official bank record, the cold, hard proof of their betrayal, was different. They recoiled as if the document was hot to the touch. The mask of indignation fell from my father's face, replaced by the pale shock of being caught. My mother's composure didn't just crack. It shattered. Her gaze fell, unable to meet mine. Then I delivered the final terms. The purchase price was fair, based on current market realities, not past glories. The contract I placed before them was standard except for one very specific clause. Clause 14b. It stipulated that as part of the transition, to ensure continuity with long-standing clients, 2 new roles would be created. They were entry-level positions on the client transition team. The roles were offered to them. They were speechless. The prospect of working, in a junior capacity, for the son whose ambition they had belittled, was a fall far deeper and more humiliating than any financial loss. Their pride, the bedrock of their identities, shattered in the silent, sunlit room. In the quiet aftermath, after the signatures were dry and they had left the conference room, I retreated to my office. There was no celebration, only a quiet ritual. I brewed a black coffee and took it to the window. The victory felt less like an endpoint and more like a return to the simple truth my grandfather had left me on a napkin. This wasn't just a reassessment of their lives. It was a reassessment of my own. Had this act of forcing them into humility changed me? Had I become colder, more like them? I considered the possibility and resolved to guard against it. I would be a leader who was both firm and empathetic. Vantage Holdings would be a place of growth, not humiliation. I immediately began drafting the transition program, creating mentorship roles for senior Harrison staff and scheduling one-on-one meetings with my parents for the following week. Not to gloat, but to guide. The first weeks of the transition were a test for everyone. I watched as my parents entered the bustling downtown hub of Vantage Holdings and received the employee badges I had assigned them. They moved through the orientation process like ghosts from another era. Adults stepping into a classroom they had long refused to enter. Employees whispered, of course. Longtime Harrison clients who called to inquire about the changes were stunned when Mom herself took their calls, stumbling over the new customer relationship management software, but her voice steady and professional. My rebellion against their past humiliation was not violent or loud. It was administrative. It was systematic. I assigned my father to an outreach cohort focused on client retention and my mother to a learning group where she was paired with a bright, patient account manager who was barely older than their own daughter. Slowly, miraculously, small successes began to mount. A major client who had been on the verge of leaving agreed to a demo after a surprisingly candid call with Dad. It felt like the first hairline crack in the thick wall of his old arrogance. The climax was quieter than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't a single, dramatic moment of public humiliation. Revenge that ends in ashes is an empty meal. Instead, the payoff arrived in the small, grinding, day-to-day realities. Dad's first successful client retention meeting using our software. Mom's meticulously crafted email to a longtime customer that resulted in them signing up for a new pilot program. The single, desperate phone call from Lucas, who couldn't bring himself to ask me for money. My parents were feeling the consequences in full. They had lost their throne, but in its place, they had found work. They were transforming under the pressure, humility growing where pride once festered. One ordinary Wednesday morning, about 4 months into the transition, Dad came to my office and stood awkwardly by the door. "You were right," he said, his voice small but sincere. "About the platform. About all of it." The next day, Mom sent me an email. The subject line was just one word: sorry. The body of the message was short. "We're sorry we didn't see you." The words were imperfect, insufficient to cover the depth of the wound, but they were honest. In that moment, I felt a strange and profound sense of release, not the thrill of victory, but the quiet relief of a long, heavy weight being lifted. The lesson had been delivered. Months turned into a year. Vantage Holdings' portfolio numbers exceeded all projections. The integration of Harrison Capital's assets was a resounding success, and our valuation soared into the billions. We had rehired dozens of former Harrison employees, retraining them and giving them tools to succeed in a modern financial landscape. My grandfather's advice became the core principle of my leadership style. The moral of my story wasn't simply that revenge is sweet. It was that accountability is a more powerful and constructive force than vengeance. The Harrisons had been given a chance to rebuild, not just their careers, but their characters. And they had taken it. The past would never be erased, but it no longer defined them. Their pride had softened into practice. Some evenings, I found myself standing at my office window, looking out at the sprawling city lights, and reminding myself of the choice I made. Success can be a weapon to feed the ego, or it can be a tool to heal wounds. I chose the latter. The most satisfying victory isn't about shaming those who underestimated you. It's about building a future so undeniable that they are forced to see the world, and you, with new eyes. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel.